Welcome back, a new phase of federalism. Alright, so states' rights. We're talking about powers reserved to the states as indicated by the 10th Amendment. So we like to look at conflict in this AP Gov course. And so this is one of our ways to look at conflict, is kind of that idea of states' rights versus federal supremacy. So we put the 10th Amendment in contrast or in conflict with the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Commerce Clause, those sorts of things. So let's look at the 10th Amendment. Here's the text of the 10th Amendment. This is the entirety of the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, so if it wasn't given to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, so it didn't say the states can't do it, those powers are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. We're going to focus on the reserved to the states respectively. First of all, you see that this is not a list of the rights of states. Rather, it is saying everything else belongs to the states. So if it wasn't mentioned specifically, it's a state power. That's what the 10th Amendment says. If it wasn't specifically given to the federal nor prohibited to the states, it belongs to the states. That's the basic argument. And so proponents of states' rights love the 10th Amendment, and they are going to use the 10th Amendment to bolster and strengthen their case. Along these lines, so now we're kind of thinking, so these terms are jumping up to the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s and getting into the 90s. This is that new federalism. So we went from dual federalism, we went to cooperative from the 1930s on, and the last 2 to 3 decades, we've seen somewhat of a return to having more distinct lines of responsibility for federal and state programs. At least that's the idea. Whether that's actually taken place very much, I think, is pretty debatable. But this has been something that especially the Republican Party has tried to push. Some areas they've been successful, some less successfully. Their biggest success has probably been at the Supreme Court level with cases like U.S. versus Lopez and U.S. versus Morrison. But the idea behind new federalism is this: to make it resemble dual federalism more than it does in actuality. Another term that goes along with that same idea is devolution, attempts to bring or to give power back to the states. So again, this is the idea that, hey, the 10th Amendment says everything else should be a state power. We know the federal government has taken over a lot of those things, especially through grants. They've gotten to have more influence, and this is trying to give some of those powers back to the states. So devolution. I have a picture of Ronald Reagan there. I want you to associate devolution with Reagan, with the 1980s, with kind of a conservative movement. So what about that balance of power between the federal government and the states? This kind of our big picture, just snapshot of the unit as a whole in 2 lines. Well, since the ratification of the Constitution, the power of the federal government has grown tremendously, as we have talked about over and over again, through grants, through the Commerce Clause, through the Necessary and Proper Clause, through the Supremacy Clause. Repeatedly, we see federal power has grown and grown and grown. In the last couple of decades, so in the past generation, there has been a slight increase in state influence. So the trend is still very much in favor of the federal government. The federal government has grown stronger and stronger, more and more influential, but there has been a bit of a movement back towards states' power in the last generation or so. Alright, remember, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button for me if this video helped you at all. This has been a LaMoney Production.